So I have a little quiz for you. What do you think Detroit is most known for in the community on a national level? You don't actually have to answer it, but
I have no idea.
but here's the bad thing: we're the #1 murder capital for trans women, and very sad.
In the U.S. or
In the
worldwide?
U.S. Yeah, in the U.S. So there was a cover story in Metro Times about it a few years ago, and from that violence that they experienced, they interviewed a lot of people through the Metro Times article about this violence, and I started thinking about how you don't see the trans community well represented. They're certainly not in history books. They're not at the table for a lot of decision making having to do with their rights. They've gone through a lot with, gender inclusive bathroom discussions at our congressional level. So there's a lot going on that they haven't really had an adequate voice to. So I started thinking maybe I should add them as a topic area to my oral history course. And so I met some really wonderful people, which you're going to hear from. Just to give this context, GLAAD, which is certainly leading gay organization nationally, has a section on their website, and this is just a little screenshot, and notice it says it's /Donald Trump, and what they've done is they've listed, and so the most current one is at the top, everything that they feel the LGBTQ community violates their rights that has gone on with the current presidential administration. And this goes on for at least 3 screens, and it's only 3 years, right? So there's a lot of things they've called out about the impact on their rights. And if you go to Wikipedia, there's also a section on protests that the gay community has organized as they've seen attempts to shrink their rights through this current administration. So there were marches pre-inauguration, there's marches post-inauguration. So the activism is very key, and I'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the stories from them. So for my oral history class, or should I say for oral histories in general, what I love about them is that we have an opportunity to capture all people, all stories. Everyone that built this country can have a voice. And so if they didn't make it into the history books, we can do so in getting them in the historic record by doing oral histories. And so I have said for a long time, being a big Detroit historian, that there's been a hero in every block in Detroit, and that's the only way Detroit survived, because we didn't have strong city services, and we didn't have a strong government, and we haven't had much money for a long time. And so my goals of the oral history class is that there would be no invisible minorities, that we would go out and we would interview activists in Detroit, environmental justice folks, the gay community, and even we've been interviewing Detroit musicians that aren't Stevie Wonder but are the backup singers for Stevie Wonder, to get their stories and their perspectives, people that wouldn't get into kind of the dialogue. I worked also as a consultant with the Black Panthers, who are the Detroit branch. They're working on creating an archive of their stories, and so I sat down and I spoke with Dr. Blair, and I said to him, how do you feel about some of these documentaries about the Black Panthers? And he said the newest one that came out they really like, because it really is their voice. And so I keep that front and center with our students to say, we're going to treat everybody with respect, and the story has to be in their words. It's their version of what happened. So far, in the 3 years we've been doing this community, we've interviewed about a dozen people. Tomorrow I'll be finishing up assigning my students for this year, the 2019 season. So we'll have another handful of folks to add to our list. We also transcribe all of the interviews and turn them over to the Reuther Library, so these are publicly available for research. And they've been used. They're starting to be used, which is really exciting, and I'll show you a little bit of that. We also decided that we would interview everybody on that LGBTQ abbreviations and try to balance it. So I worked to try to do that, to balance that as best as possible. And if you aren't aware, the Ruther is starting an LGBTQ archive specifically. And so we've been reaching out to the community, so I've been working with the archivists over there and work with Equality Michigan and Affirmations and several organizations, as well as we're working on a documentary about Jeff Montgomery, a local leader, but he was nationally known, so we're working on that. So I could change the topic every time I teach the class. I teach it in the fall, and so every year I could change the topic, but the reason I've stuck with this every year since I began it is because 100% of the narrators we've interviewed have talked about lack of rights, lack of basic civil rights. And because of that, I think it's really important that we continue to push to document the community and everything they've achieved and everything they're still fighting to achieve. So as far as the WHO, just a quick overview so you get the context of some of the folks you'll be hearing from. So at William's recommendation, who's in the room here, William Coburn recommended that we talk to doctors who were treating patients when the AIDS epidemic first began and we didn't even know how it was transmitted. And so we did that, and the sad thing is no one had ever interviewed them. I mean, it's just unheard of. And now we've got their stories on the record, and they were beautiful and heart-wrenching and very historically relevant. We also have been working with the Ruther with a group that has the best name I've ever heard. It's Trans Sistas of Color, and they're a wonderful group. And we interviewed one of their founders and one of the people that works with them, who's actually going on, she wants to get her degree with us. But they create a support system for trans women, and with how scary the violence is in the city, they're an incredibly critical organization. I called her Mom T, but there's a woman that a lot of people refer to as Mom that saved young men from the street. So often we have heard that when young men tell their families they're gay, sometimes they get kicked out and they have nowhere to go at 17, 18, 19 years old. And she took in probably dozens of people, I haven't asked her on the numbers, and she made sure that they got jobs and they were disciplined and they had respect for themselves and they had love in a home. So we've been working with her a lot. We worked with Cornelius Wilson, who was an AIDS activist, and in the 90s started trying to find homes for men that were victims of the AIDS disease, because you could legally kick someone out if you knew that they had AIDS or were HIV positive. And they again would end up on the street. So he is still active in the community and trying to make sure that people are educated about AIDS and people have somewhere safe to live. We interviewed the publisher of Metro, which is a well-known gay magazine. It's kind of like the Metro Times of the gay community, talking about events and things. And then she actually donated a run of her journals to the Ruther, so that was really nice. And then just lots of activists that have been out there, people that co-founded Affirmations and some of these other groups. So we were trying to get a widespread representation of the story of the gay community, because obviously no one person can represent everybody. So you can't probably see this very well, but this is from a spreadsheet I did of all the interviews we've done, and then I also have my students' names there because they did the work. The other one we also interviewed last year Stacy Hale, and her nickname, she's a DJ, is Hot Wax. And she is an amazing person because not only is she a mentor to young women in the gay community, but she is a female DJ, which was really unusual in the 80s when she first hit, and she is booked internationally, so she's really well known. She still lives here in Detroit. We interviewed Tim Sazzo, who manages the Menjo's, who also has a small museum of the community there. And so just trying to connect everyone that has something to say. Yeah.
How do you expand your network? Do people recommend other people?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah, I think that's
So
really it.
that could be a huge task.
Yeah, I think, that's where one of the advantages helps, that I've been in Detroit working in community groups my whole life, and so I know a lot of people, and those people know people, right? So, that's really, really helped. And William, who is here, and Tim Retzloff do a lot of hard work in the community, and William's great brainstorming, and Tim Retzloff has done an extensive dissertation of over 100 oral histories in the suburban gay community here, so he knows a lot of people, so we trade names, and he comes to speak to my class. So we've developed this. Also Jeff Montgomery, who is the person that was a national gay leader, but from the Detroit area, that we're working on his documentary right now. He connected me with several people before he passed, and so it's just building that up. But word of mouth helps, and also the fact we were able to tell Jeff this was happening before he passed away was critical, because he has so much information, he knew so many people, and by having Jeff behind us in this, and also starting the archive, gave us credibility, so that the community knew that we weren't going to interpret their story in some way that wasn't what they said, that they knew that their stories would be treated with respect. And that's really important whenever you're dealing with a community that's been really blamed, for things that aren't their fault, that has been had violence committed against them, forever in America. For a community that's had rights, lost rights, that doesn't have equal rights. So making sure they knew we would be respectful of their stories is the only way we would succeed in doing oral histories. Bree, I've got a couple quotes from her. So she said that she's a firm believer that there are going to be people who will need to take our stories and our voices in spaces that they'll never be able to. So she was really gracious when we worked with her, talking about the interview that we're conducting gives her voice added mileage to the community by being in the archives, by knowing that I will be out publicizing this and going to professional events and saying this is what we've learned. So she was really gracious about that. And she talks about the organization that she started, that she sees people that say, oh yeah, I totally support you, but then they say something homophobic. And so she's just trying to address that, and she's really into education of the greater community, that everyone has to understand what the trans community is going through, which is very, it's really rough for them, especially right now. Cornelius Wilson talked about, he started the Men of Color Motivational Group, and he's the one that helps people find housing. And he was so committed to do this interview. He's older, and he actually was in the hospital, and he contacted me, and he said, I don't know when I'm going to get out. He said, will John come to me? And we did his interview in the hospital, because the community has been so welcoming to us that they're so thrilled that someone wants their story. It's been really lovely. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with the Native American community about 20 years ago, when we were doing a documentary on the history of Detroit. And I said, you were here first. There's a name for Detroit that predates the Europeans coming here, and we want to get your story. And there's this long pause, and he said, you want to talk to us? And I said, yeah. And he said, no one ever wants to talk to us. And I think that's really stuck with me in everything I do professionally and personally, that it really breaks my heart that there are people that, whole groups of people that feel through horrible stories that no one wants to talk to them or no one wants to address who they are. And so that's the great thing once again about oral histories, that we can overcome that. And Cornelius here was talking about when he finally came out. He came out when he was a little bit older to his mom. He said he was really close to his mom, and when he finally told her and she didn't care, he thought, well, I can tell everybody then, because as long as my mama supports me, then no one else matters, which was, I think, a really lovely story. And he also talks about his mission there was about education and about how confusing it was when he first got involved, that there were a lot of men that were HIV positive that said they weren't gay, but were involved in gay relationships. And so he was trying to figure out how to educate them when they weren't even talking to themselves about who they were exactly, and the challenges that involved with HIV education. Alexandra also works at Trans Sisters, and she is basically the mentee of Bree that I showed earlier. And she was very much talking about racial differences among the gay groups, which is something important to document, that if not everyone feels comfortable in every organization, that's something maybe the organization needs to look at. So she talked about that a lot. She talked about the fact that without an organization like this, a lot of trans folks turn to sex work because they need to eat, and a lot of times they can't get regular jobs, and so then they're exposed to more violence. Yeah.
You only have to look at the woman locally who was fired from her job at the funeral home that's now before the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yeah, and next week is really an important week. Yeah. And so there's affirmations, which many people are familiar with in Ferndale, but there's also the Ruth Ellis Center here in, I think technically they're Highland Park, aren't they? And Ruth Ellis was a famous lesbian who was out very early on, lived to be 100, and started this organization for gay runaways, so they would have some safe place to go. And they do fundraisers every year, etc. It's a great organization, but she feels like there's kind of a dividing line between sort of white suburban gays who go to affirmations and people of color that hang out more through to Ruth Ellis, and she's saying that that's not quite the way it should be. Yeah.
Do you have documentation of connections between people you interviewed? Both like people like who recommended who, and also maybe, I don't know if it comes up in interviews at all.
It comes up in interviews very often. In fact, at the end of a lot of interviews, you'll hear people say, hey, have you guys interviewed so-and-so? You should interview so-and-so. And so then I have to do cleanup because, of course, my students aren't going to be here next year, so I've got to make sure I pull those out of the transcripts as I go through to quality check them before I give them to the reader. I mean, I know who recommended who, but I haven't really documented that. No, I haven't. I guess I didn't see a huge historical importance to that, but maybe I should revisit it.
I just think it would be really interesting if, like, people with who are more connected, like, experienced,
Yeah.
similar things or had similar perspectives.
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
And which I don't know if that was one of
Yeah.
but that's really
Great. And we interviewed Greg, who's a historic preservationist in Palmer Park area. And if you're not familiar, Palmer Park was really a safe haven community for gays for generations, and they also have some beautiful architecture. So you've got a lot of people documenting the historic architecture there. There's still an event there, Hotter Than July, for the gay community every July there. And he was talking about, and some other people talked about Palmer Park as well. And we've been trying to reach out to the Palmer Park community of the past to try to document this, because we know that They had early weddings there, as Tim mentioned in his research, that long before it was ever thought that this would be legal between two same-sex folks. So also, Greg talks just about that, you know, you could hold hands in public in that community, you know, which is such a blessing. So they really, he talks about that. And then he does talk about the AIDS crisis, and here he's talking about that they were going to memorial service every weekend at one point. And one of his choir members passed, and he said, "Tell me he got hit by a truck. Tell me he got run over by a car. Tell me his elbow slipped down his throat and strangled him, but don't tell me he died of AIDS," because he just couldn't handle one more friend being gone from that. And I thought that was just such an amazingly powerful quote to really take you to that time of desperation and sadness that the community was facing. And I'm so pleased that we got that on the record. And here he's talking about the election, and I like the way he phrased this. He said, it tells him that there are a lot of people just sitting there waiting to be aggrieved. And I think that that's a really keen observation. Dr. Paul Benson, we interviewed, and one of my students that interviewed one of these two doctors, her brother is gay, and she had a hard time with this interview because she's hearing about young men being thrown out of their houses because they're gay and living on the streets with AIDS, and how traumatic it was, and they didn't have any medicine, and she just broke down and was crying, and it was really hard on her. So she wanted to do this initially because she wanted to support her brother and his community's history, but you know, we had to have a talk afterward about how hard this was for her. And it is very emotional, and that if you have any empathy at all, that's a tough part of oral history, is that sometimes you want to pause the reporter and just give them a hug and let them pull themselves together, and that's okay. The thing I think that struck me so much about the two doctors we interviewed is that, you know, they had no idea, they didn't even know it was a virus for a long time. They didn't know how it was communicated. They didn't know what they could do, and they talk about how they could just treat symptoms, and that's it. And his quote here is very painful. He said, he felt like Dr. Kevorkian without the publicity, helping people die with dignity, because all he could do was treat their symptoms. He had absolutely nothing else to treat them with. And then he talks about the fact that he's still practicing. We did the interview in his doctor's office in Ferndale. And he felt like when he ended up treating so many folks with AIDS that he didn't, that other doctors maybe were looking down on him, that, and he finds that ironic now because now he's sought after as an AIDS expert, and so it's come full circle, and so we got that on the record as well. And here's a uncomfortable reaction he had just recently, which is that he was at the Michigan State Medical Society, and he was talking about HIV prevention, and he found this note on his seat when he got back. If you want to get rid of HIV, just get rid of the gays. So that is happening in 2016, 2017 still, you know. Horrific. We have a much better understanding of this issue now. Obviously, we know it's not just a gay disease, and that that trauma that he feels, even professionally, is important. Again, that we are documenting this for people to know what the community is still going through, despite everything he has done as a human being to help people.
It just seems like that person's medical license should seriously be questioned. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
And if they're like that far behind on medical evidence, I doubt they are.
Yeah.
But
Oops, I'm sorry. There's a little quote. Can you hear it?
I don't really think so. It's something in the metamorphosis that like started out as being not respected, dirty, clandestine doctor, to now I'm, very well accepted with a good reputation. education. I'm talking amongst the medical department. We still have a ways to go. I gave a lecture about 3 weeks ago at the Michigan State
And he was
Medical
talking about that.
Society. But it was the general practitioners, and I was talking about HIV prevention. And somebody left me a note on the table that says, if you want to get rid of HIV, just get rid of the AIDS. I did like seeing that. And I have that piece of paper too, that sometimes when I lecture, I always like to throw the hook out there first for my audience before I get into the didactical part of it. And, you know, I use that slip of paper as well. So as much as so much stigma is gone and we're doing so much better, we still have that work to do.
Do you think the stigma's
Like an I don't really think so. Except again, the metamorphosis that I started out as being
Oops, it's repeating, sorry. And then Dr. Stephen Miller, we also interviewed, and I know that type's a little bit smaller, but, he was talking about, how excited they were when they got AZT as finally some kind of treatment, but it caused so many side effects. It was heartbreaking to him because he had kind of put a lot of hope on this drug, and what else it was doing to the people's bodies was making it harder to treat them. So it was a start, but definitely, but having this on the record as a moment in time as to what the doctors in the medical field were going through, I feel is very historically significant. And here he mentioned that President Reagan never even mentioned the word AIDS. And, obviously this epidemic was happening during his administration. And he talks about how ACT UP and other organizations helped to publicize the need in the community for better medicine, for housing, for just general care and respect of patients. And how things are changing for the better. We had a great time talking to Danny Woods, and she is a Detroit police officer, and she is the LGBTQ liaison with the police officers. So they have a community liaison going back just a few years now, and she had been a police officer for 4 years, working in major crimes, and saw in her police partners a lot of misunderstanding about the gay community. And when you're walking into an event as a police officer with a partner who doesn't understand the community, and the story she tells is about, it was a domestic violence call, it was between two women, and her male partner, straight partner, was very offensive in how he talked about it and didn't consider it a big issue. And so she thought, we need more understanding, we need more training for our police officers to be understanding to the community. So she now leads an intensive training, not just in Detroit, but all over America, about how to educate the police to deal with the gay community. And she is very proud to say, this is not a little 1-hour lecture. This is an intensive 8-hour training, where you understand the facts about violence against the gay communities, you understand how to talk to people, you understand about pronouns, to ask people what pronouns they want to use. So she's wonderful, very approachable, and here's this is a little long, we'll see how I'm doing that time.
I want to task force mentality again, I guess we are ready to make it happen again, we'll make it happen, because I really just didn't know what to do. And so when Chief Craig came in, one of his first orders of business was who's representing the LGBT community. And they dug me up. They were like, she's over here, so I come over, I meet with him, and he's like, yeah, so I want you to contact this person, because I worked with them, I put this person in place when I was in Cincinnati, and I've done this and done that. So I was like, okay, I reached out to a couple people, but what they had to offer me didn't really direction. And so, the task force I was on when the HIP was shut down, and came back over to Detroit and was working at Major Crimes. And I'll never forget it. I was talking to my boss, and Assistant Chief DeLunt at the time came down, and he's like, "Hey, Woods, that LGBT thing that you're doing, can you do it from upstairs at the chief's office?" I said, "Well, probably do it out the trunk of my car." He said, "Don't be a smart ass." But we had that kind of relationship. But I'm like, "What?" "Yeah." So he's like, "Okay, effective Monday, you'll be working upstairs." "Wait, what? It's Thursday. Like, I gotta go. I'm not the room." He's like, "Yeah, you'll be upstairs." And so I'm like, "Wow, okay." So I get to working up there, and still I'm just like, what to do? How do I start? And so I reached out to Equality Michigan and began talking with them, particularly Yvonne Cypher. When I tell you, she is definitely like a saving grace for me, because she taught me a lot. And with a lot, I mean basically that you have to find out what it is that the community wants and the community needs from the police. And in turn, you have to find out how the police department can be of greater service to the community. And those things really sat with me as like foundation points. So we did a training, we partnered and did a training. And in that training, I was able to translate LGBT to UPD and translate UPD to LGBT.
So,
all
which
the
is
time.
nice quote. And we also have Ricky Barkoff, who is was a drag, still performs drag shows, and she became a mother figure for a lot of young men and even women, to take them in and give them discipline and run a household. So I include the interplay between my student and her here. So Jamie's asking her, okay, growing up, what kinds of social services did you have access to? Absolutely none is the answer, right? So at least for gay youth now, there are organizations, there's mentors, there's better health care, but I just cannot imagine if you're, 50 or older, how alone you would feel in the community at that time without these, especially if you didn't have support family. So it's good for, I think, this kind of oral history for youth to see what went on before them and the struggles. She had a lot to say, so she was talking about, she tells the story that she heard about someone who's dying of AIDS in a motel somewhere. Family wouldn't come near him, nobody was helping him, and she went and picked him up and brought him to her house. And she had, I think, a little ranch, and sometimes there were like as many as 13 people living there. And the other folks in the family were nervous because we still didn't exactly know about how AIDS was transmitted. They were worried they were going to get ill, and she just said straight out, he's not going to die alone, not him. So she took him in and cared for him until his family came and took him, and she regrets that because she doesn't feel they cared for him very well. But it's an important story, and she tried. And this kind of human being is really important to document. It's not the kind of person that usually gets in the history books, but this kind of amazing empathy and selflessness is really, I think, important for us to see as a wonderful example. She performs at Gigi's, which is the oldest gay bar, and they do drag shows regularly. But she talks about, and this is something I think that raises awareness in a very important way, that the entertainers were critical during the height of the AIDS epidemic because they were doing fundraisers constantly for people that couldn't afford their drugs, that couldn't afford care. And that is an important piece that I had never thought about, and I'm sure a lot of people hadn't, but she gets it. And so for her to share that is really important. And you know, of course, there's lots of examples in these oral histories of discrimination, of people having terrible things written on their doors, of people being threatened with violence, that, you know, sadly, you know, needs to be documented. She, when she first was learning the drag industry, she worked at the Gold Dollar, not too far from here, recently burned down, and they were not allowed to use the bathroom. So there was a bucket out the back door that they were told to use. So you were good enough to perform, but not good enough to use the bathroom. Typical discrimination we see against various groups through our history. So, but it's important for people to know, you know, again, what she went through. And here she mentions that Ronald Reagan cut off funding for AIDS research. And you know, she's very bitter about that. And these, again, how politics affect the individual is very interesting and good to get on the record. And here's a blurb from her.
What other political issues have been important to you?
Of course, the marriage. Another great gift that was given to me is when the transgendered community was allowed to have their birth certificates and everything changed. If they were deemed, if you want to use that word, mentally female or male. That was another huge step in the direction for the transgender community. And for myself, it was probably one of the greatest days of my life when I got to go and change my driver's license and everything. I remember many, many years ago, my mother and dad asked me not to change my given name, which was Richard. Very few people know that. That was my given name. My mother and dad asked me not to change that until they left this earth. And if I could do that for them, because that was their gift to me. And I said, of course, after all they did for me, and nobody had to know that my name was Richard. And after my mother died, many years ago, I'm going to say probably 12 or 13 years now, I went downtown. And it was really strange because I petitioned to have my name changed, and where you get your name changed is where you also get a divorce and pay alimony and child support and everything. And I remember getting called up to the front, and the judge was there, and she looks at me and she said, "Are you here for a divorce?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you here for child support, alimony?" I said, "No." And the bailiff, I believe, I don't know what the gentleman is that stands next to her, he said, "Keep going." And she covered up the microphone, the judge, and she said, "You are not Richard." And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Oh my God." And she said, "You look great." And I said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you very much." And she said, this was her word, she said, "I get some real bruisers up here." She said, "They don't look anything like you." And she said, "You're little, you're only 5 feet tall." I said, "Yeah, I am." And she said, "Of course, name change granted." And I left there. And that was phenomenal. The Secretary of State and changed my driver's license and everything, it still had the M for male, of course, you know, and that I wanted to change desperately, but we didn't have that right. And once again, through President Obama and the Democrats, I even got that right. And two of my best friends, who are my kids, as I call them, Eric and Ivan, they took me to Lansing, and I was able to change all of that. Yeah. And when I went down, even though it was legal, when I went downtown Detroit to do it, they wouldn't do it. They sent me to Lansing to do it. Yeah.
Were they ignorant that the law had changed, or did they, what was the reason they gave you to send you to Lansing?
That they were ignorant. Yeah, they weren't going to do it. Yeah. They said, you have to take this to Lansing. They were very rude and cruel about it. And I thought, if you think an hour ride is going to stop me from living out a dream, you're all crazy. We got in the car, we went to Lansing, we did it all. They were so nice and so respectful and everything. Yeah, wished me the best of luck and everything. Yeah.
Great.
Yes. There are.
We also interviewed Shay Howell, who she's a professor at Oakland and really brilliant, also a very active Detroit activist. And I thought it was, she's very, very intelligent about politics and sort of how everything fits in the big picture. And so she said what she thought about the 2016 election was that the country never changes because of electoral politics. She said that Trump is the resistance to what will be the future, because the future isn't him. And I found that her positivity and her hope was really kind of a nice counterbalance to some of the other things that we'd seen that certainly people have been through over time. And we also talked to Jan Stevenson, and she talks about the election as well. That she was talking about exactly what's coming up with the Supreme Court, which is you can get married legally, but you can also be fired for being gay. So now you can get married, but all the pieces of the puzzle aren't together yet. And so the struggle is still very, very real. And I went to a session where I met, I met some of these folks that Menjo's did sort of an elders session. So they had folks that had been on the front lines fighting for equal rights, and they had a lot of young people, and it's a big room. I mean, there were hundreds, you were there were hundreds of people there. It was standing room only, and it was so nice to see, for the elders to see that the young people still cared about the activism. And so I've since interviewed several of those folks that were on the stage that night. And you know, the advice, and especially this came from Ricky, was, you know, get off the computer and go meet people in person and talk about what we need, because there's never a time that the gay community can be comfortable in their rights, because we don't have full rights. There's still a lot of people against full rights, and the struggle is still ongoing. And so that advice was, you know, is echoed kind of here with Jan Stevenson. She's talking about the fact that the Equality Act needs to be passed so that there's equal rights for all. And this was a really, really nice surprise. I didn't know they were doing this. So they used some of our oral histories at the Detroit Historical Museum for an exhibit a few weeks ago, and they sent me the storyboard to show for today. And they have the quote from Ricky there that says, being a member of the community was wonderful at the bar, it was wonderful in your apartment, it was horrible every place else. You didn't dare hold hands in public, you didn't dare show any affection in public. You prayed that you got out of your car safely and into the bar, because police would be watching and harassing you in the parking lot. And Tim Retzloff, who's a very distinguished scholar, did a speech at the exhibit on a lot of his research, which was really phenomenal. And William mentioned at the end that, to our knowledge, this is the first time a major museum in the Metro Detroit area has done any exhibit of the LGBTQ community. I mean, we're in 2019, right? So it was amazing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if I may say, it just points out to the extraordinary importance of work that Kim has been doing, because there's nobody else doing this. And Tim Retzloff, you mentioned over and over, and he's kind of the one other person in the entire state who is spending his academic career documenting the gay community. That's it. And this is a wonderful exhibit, but it's in one tiny room in the basement. And it did come about because of the strategic plan at the Detroit Historical Museum about diversity. It came about because one of their assistant curators was studying at Wayne State and was a student of Tracy Newman, and was
history.
inspired by one of the classes where they had a Skype call from a gay historian in Miami who was documenting Miami gay history. And he said, well, has anybody done anything about Detroit? So he talked to the Historical Museum, they okayed him. This was in part for the 50th anniversary of Stonewall. And in the process of their hosting that exhibit, they looked into their own collection and discovered they had one item in the entire collection of the Detroit Historical Museum that relates to the gay community, and they only got it by accident. It's like a bar guide that ended up in someone's estate in the 1970s. There's no effort to document, no effort to collect. And this is not just true at the Historical Museum, but the main library's never done anything, the art museum's never done anything, the symphony's never done anything. Nobody has done anything focused on gay life, gay artists, Detroit gay history. So that only points out more of Kim's passion, empathy, and respect for the community and integrity has opened doors and great willingness for people who've never been asked. So we just really want to commend you and your students, because you transmit that. The students already have that. You transmit it to your students, so that's wonderful.
Thank you. I feel really good about the work we're doing, and it was great to prepare for this today, to really sort of mine through the transcripts and look at some of the trends. So I'm hoping to continue. I put in a request to present on this at a regional archive conference at NAC, and we'll see if that gets approved. But it's really important. Most of our professional organizations have subgroups about LGBTQ collections. So the Society of American Archivists does, which is our biggest national organization. So it's nice to see, and that's been around for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, and you're seeing organizations in major unions that have, a section for LGBTQ community members to join and to band together and to socialize as well. So, we're definitely seeing progress in rights and pockets. But what happens next week with the Supreme Court is really a really big deal. So we'll have to stay tuned to that. But I'm hopeful we'll just continue to keep documenting. And I guess I would ask if there's any questions.
Mr. Moore.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Kim. That was great. I'm sorry I came late. I wanted to follow up on something that you said about, I was wondering if there's been any outreach to the artist community, because all those folks are getting older also, and I know that in my husband and my art collection, we have several pieces done from that period that speak directly to the AIDS crisis, and by local artists. And is this project continuing, and are you planning on moving into other creative communities?
Yeah, we certainly could. I mean, I know Diane Seibeldin interviewed the Cass Corridor, a lot of Cass Corridor artists, as far as that goes. So some in the community might have been in that list. I haven't looked. I haven't really targeted any specific group other than whoever I can bend their ear.
I have a couple of people who
that would be great.
Really important to talk to.
No, that would be great. I'm always looking for more names to interview. And I'm, like I said at the beginning, that we're continuing to do this group, this community, and I'll be assigning my students tomorrow to their person they're interviewing. So.
Great. I'll send you an email.
Okay.
Do you feel comfortable mentioning names?
The first one that comes to mind is Gary Linko, and then Dennis Naraki. But Gary has been a work functioning artist. He lives in Corntown.
Yeah, that would be.
And yeah, we have 2 pieces specifically that he did that from the early '80s that are specifically about that I actually hope to donate to Wayne State.
Oh, nice.
But yeah, and Gary probably could give you tons of names. I mean,
Great.
to me, he would be your doorway.
Okay. No, that would be.
I'm glad you mentioned that because it sparked another name. You had a really good idea, Carlton Mulinari.
Oh, yeah.
The artist who's
Oh.
coordinated the first Artists for AIDS fundraisers that he's
Oh,
still
that would
coordinating,
be
like
great.
30 years later,
Yeah.
every year. He's very
Yeah.
visible.
Yeah, they just ended it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
This would seem challenging, but I was wondering if you have considered or hope to capture an oral histories from some people who aren't that people
Yeah,
so
if I
feel
got
like
their
invisible
names.
within-
That's the problem.
Well,
There's the
I
rub.
was thinking like,
Yeah.
you know, if their names were, not shared.
Well, the problem though is we donate it to the Ruther, and we want that to be open. We don't want to donate material that's got to be closed for 10 or 20 years until they pass or they come out. So, we try